My name is Tani Schwartz-Herman. I'm a program director in JTS's Department of Community Engagement. I'm so pleased to welcome you to summer series, A Wandering People, Jewish Journeys, Real and Imagined. I want to welcome any first-time attendees and welcome to today's session, The Early Modern Travel Paths, Controlling the Plague and Jewish Mobility in 16th Century Tuscany with Dr. Stefanie Siegmund, Women's League Chair in Jewish Gender and Women's Studies at JTS. I want to thank today's Chacham sponsor, Anne and Ben Schwartz. Thank you so much for your generosity. If you're feeling inspired by this opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to partner with us by sponsoring a learning session. We have two sponsorship levels, Chacham for $540 and Sadiq for $1,000. And we just put some information in the chat where you can learn more if you'd like to sponsor a session. Just to review how we'll do Q&A for today's session, Dr. Siegmund will pause periodically throughout the session. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to me, to Tani Schwartz-Herman, and I will select a few of the questions to present to Professor Siegmund. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with Stacy Firestone. The PowerPoint presentation will be screen shared during the session. I'm so pleased now to introduce Dr. Siegmund. Dr. Stefanie Siegmund is the first person to hold the Women's League Chair in Jewish Gender and Women's Studies at JTS, and is the Associate Professor of History and Director of the Jewish Gender and Women's Studies program at JTS. She also serves as the Area Coordinator for the program in Medieval and Early Modern Jewish Studies. A specialist in the history of the Jewish family and the Jews of the early modern Italian states, her current research focuses on the subject of conversion of Jews to Catholicism in 16th century Italy. Her work engages questions concerning gender and its role in creating Jewish custom, culture, and law, as well as the history and status of Jewish women. I'm so pleased now to turn it over to Dr. Siegmund.
All right, I have unmuted. Have you got me? Thank you, Tani, for the introduction. And I'm so delighted to see the gallery of faces because I'm beginning to recognize students who were in context with me and at other various concerts over the lectures and classes over the years. And it's really lovely to see you all. So thank you for coming this afternoon. When I was asked to give a talk that had something to do with travel and movement, I really jumped immediately. And I said, I have something for that. I have something that's really important during this COVID year that comes right out of my work on the 16th century, which is incredible. That's really strange. And the reason that I had it all ready to go the basic concept is because when I work in the Italian archives, I discover documents that no one has ever seen before. That's the great joy of being an historian. And some of the documents that I discovered from the 16th century, I'm calling travel permits, okay? Travel passes, travel permits. And nobody had written about these before. And I want to share them with you today. And the very interesting connection that I will draw between passports, these travel permits from the 16th century, and the passports as we know them today, and also the very complicated and interesting question of the vaccine card, okay? The vaccine card that I have on my refrigerator right now. You know, the passport's in the drawer somewhere and I haven't used it for a long time, but the vaccine card is on the fridge so that I don't lose it. And my son did lose it and we had to get it replaced. So that's quite possible. As we've gone through this year of COVID, we have heard a lot about the comparison with the Spanish flu of 1918. But since we are students of Jewish history, we're also thinking, I'm sure, about the Great Black Death in 1348 to 1350. Can I have a nod? A nod, good, thank you. So my talk today covers material that happens 2 centuries after the Great Black Death, but it is what sets everything in motion. When half the population in Europe dies, that means in most cities, 30 to 50% of people are dying. The governments and the survivors have to think what to do, right? What to do to prevent this from happening again? What are the tools necessary? What's going on religiously or scientifically? And that's going to be directly connected to my talk for today. Okay. So let's go to the 16th century for a minute, because you might think you don't know anything about that or the early modern period. And since that's my time period, I'm going to give you one paragraph to help you understand that you do know what the time period is that I'm going to talk about, right? This is the time of the invention of the printing press in the 15th century and the quick development of Hebrew printing right after that, within 2 decades. This is the period of the Italian and Netherlandish artistic renaissance. It is the introduction of African slavery to the Atlantic coast of Portugal, to the new conquests of Spain and Portugal, all right, and eventually the Netherlands and England and France. It is the period of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. It is the time of the Protestant Reformation, of the Catholic reaction, which is the Catholic Reformation. It is the time of warfare between the Catholics and the Turks. And finally, you know about the rise of the Kabbalah in Sfat. That's our time period. That's when we are, right? Between the Black Death and Sfat, the Kabbalah in Safed. But what this time is to me is also a time of new restrictions on the Jews and Jewish mobility. And there are 2 that I've written about. For me, the big one is the ghettoization. And that's going to come directly into our talk today also. Ghettoization means that Jews were forced to live in areas that had gates that were closed at night. Very simple. That's what it means. And I'm going to go into that further. And that's a tool, I would call it a technology of power that is spatial. And when you talk about things that are spatial, you're talking about the ability of people to move in and out of spaces, whether or not there are firm boundaries around them. So the second tool of tool or technology of power that is spatial, that is special to the early modern period, is the travel permit that I discovered, that I've written about, and that later other scholars for later time periods have written about, and that becomes something like a passport. This is an administrative tool, okay? And I want to talk about what its purpose is and how it's used and how I see it as a precursor to these other types of documents. So let's sit back. You could show your hands. How many of you have a passport, your first ever, we're not going to write the chats and answer, right? Your first ever passport, you still held on to it, whether or not you were supposed to, in your drawer? Yeah, I see a lot of hands. Mine too. Your first passport. And I don't have any idea if you have parents or grandparents who had passports. And if you wouldn't mind sticking that into a chat, and maybe we'll find out if a lot of people said yes or no later. But did you have parents or grandparents who had passports? And I'm going to doubt it that we have those things. Passports are relatively recent. Oh, 100 years. That's not so recent. But there weren't any real passports until 1914, the end of the First World War. Before the end of the First World War, people traveled, wealthy people traveled, and they traveled with a letter of introduction. They traveled with a letter of introduction that established their status wherever they went. You know, this is who this gentleman is, and he is sent here on a diplomatic mission or to spend time at your um, uh, at your house as a guest, right? We ask that he be shown certain courtesies. Um, these were letters of introduction, not passports. The first thing that historians call really a passport shows up in the Ottoman Empire a little bit before that, in 1844, but not in Europe or in America. Passports become official with a photograph in them by 1920. And the story of the passport in the 20th century is a story of a social history. What mattered to the government to put in that passport? What did they write down? Right? What had to be there? Now, I could take one example, gender, and show you how times change based in what's in your passport. In the beginning, passports for women, because they did have them, always mentioned the name of the husband, if there was one. Always. It never just said, Jane Doe. It was always Jane Doe, wife of Robert Doe, right? But men, their wives were not referred to. Nobody wrote down the names of their wives in a passport. Why would they? Right? When women finally lobbied to have that removed so that they would be there with their own name, whether it was their husband's name or their maiden name, right? When they finally got rid of that, that was a change in social attitudes towards women. Another moment in 1977, for the first time, the passport includes gender. Why? Isn't it obvious? You can look at the names and see the gender. But in the 70s, there was a bit of a social crisis about gender. Men were wearing long hair and women were wearing short hair, all right? And roles were changing and there were feminists. And the powers that be in the government wanted this written down in the passports. They were not thinking about gender fluidity at the time. They just wanted it locked into place that men were men and women were women, and we needed to assert that, right? And it needed to be obvious, as though it wasn't obvious looking at the person. But then in 2019, gender has changed again. And now the passport allows for gender X for people who cannot say that they are in the category of male or female or prefer not to say. A non-binary gender is possible in the passport. Now, it doesn't sound like I'm talking about Jewish history yet, does it? No. And how many minutes have passed? 13. So we're going to move to Jewish history. Documentation is terribly important in Jewish history. Jews had to have documents to establish their right in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period to live somewhere in the first place. And I'm going to share my screen with you in just a moment to talk about the evolution of documents that were related to Jewish residency. And at this point, I'm moving into the 16th century in Italy, where I can actually call myself an expert. So I'm going to share my screen somehow. There we go. Give me a sec. Oh, sorry. All right. Tani, good? Good. All right. I put some of these slides up so that you can see, but I really am going to talk them through and you don't need to read them. There are 3 types of documents to know about for Italy, for even one century, the 16th century. The first one goes back earlier. The first that those of you who have taken context will have heard of is the condotta, or the charter. Jews in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period had to approach the authorities or were invited by a town or a city or a state to live in a certain place with a legal contract. Other people didn't have this sort of contract. You are permitted to live in our town with the following conditions, which are negotiated. They're not imposed on the Jews because the Jews have a choice as to whether or not to live there. You see, they don't have to live there. And for the most part, in the beginning, they weren't already living there. So, typical example, a Jewish banking family, otherwise known as moneylenders, decides to branch out and move to a new town. Let's try Pistoia or Prato. They write a letter introducing themselves, and they say, we'd like to move in. And the government responds to them, well, we're going to take you, a certain number of you, and here is the rate of interest that you are allowed to charge, 20% annual rate, which for them is much, much better, the Pistoians, than the 30 or 40% that a Christian shark might be charging, or pure poverty and people unable to get loans that they need. Whether it's the church, the nobility, or the poor, people want loans. That's a condotta. And the documents, which have all been preserved, say you can have your synagogue, you can have your kosher food, we won't bother you on the holidays, you may not socialize with the Christians, eating and drinking with them, even though you will. You may not come out during the Christian holidays and harass the Christians who are celebrating their holidays, their processions as they go through the town, and on and on and on. This is what will happen to the pledges if people default on them. And you bankers may have support staff. Families may move in with you. You're going to end up having somebody who can be your servant, your messenger, your agent, your shochet, right? There's going to be a community building up around you. And this charter is for 15 years. Okay. The basis of your residence in our territory is 15 years. And you're going to pay a certain sum for that privilege. You can do all the banking and profit making you want, but we're taking 300 florins for those annually for those years. And you're doing this, you're negotiating this because you know you're going to make more than that, or you're hoping you're going to make more than that. This is the condotta, the charter. Okay. Meanwhile, Jews need to travel. And when they want to travel, they do not want to be harassed as Jews. So they seek out letters of safe conduct. Letters of safe conduct, the salvacondotta, is a different document that goes in the breast pocket or in a chest that's being carried by the horses, along with in their own retinue of probably an armed guard with them if they're traveling with money, or their family and some servants. The wealthy are the ones who obtain the salvacondotta. And why do they need it? They need it because they are the elite. They have wealth. Not all Jews do. This is the elite that we're talking about. They have wealth. They might be bankers. They might be physicians. They need to travel away from home on dangerous roads that are dangerous for anybody with money. And there's something that you've heard of called the Jewish badge. Putting my hand over my chest because it was sometimes a circle of cloth that had to be pinned onto the outer coat. And at other times it was a hat for men of a different color. And for women in some parts of Italy, it was a hoop earring, a golden hoop earring which they didn't really want to wear because it had become the custom and the fashion of prostitutes to wear the hoop earring. When Jews traveled, they did not want to be spotted as obvious targets as Jews. And so their salvacondota also permitted them to not wear those badges while they were traveling. And so they could look like ordinary Italians with their armed guards protected, or just traveling along looking like anybody else. The salvacondota. Now, a salvacondota is relevant only if you're allowed to travel in the first place from one city to the other. And it's a phenomenon, the possession of these safe conducts, which look very much like visas or passports. They fade in importance when the Jews are ghettoized. When the Jews are ghettoized, they are supposed to live in one place, and they're not supposed to be traveling around at all. And that is where we get to the stage 3, the travel pass, which is after the institution of the ghettos. All right. So as I just to reiterate, privileged Jews get papers of safe conduct. They can't be arrested while they're out there. They also are protected from taxes. They're exempted from local requirements. And this is in Florence until 1571 throughout the city, throughout the state of Tuscany. But then comes the Edict of Ghettoization, the Edict of Expulsion from the entire territory. There are 23 towns from which Jews were expelled in 1571. And they all those Jews had to, 700 of them had to move into one city, Florence, one city, a constriction of space and of their mobility, and of course of their economy and their autonomy in all sorts of ways. But when they're in this ghetto, are they ever allowed out? What is a ghetto? So a ghetto, as I mentioned before, is a section of the city which has gates which are closed at night and actually locked by a hired gatekeeper, whom actually the Jews are supposed to pay. But people need to leave the ghetto all day long, and they do. People are allowed to leave. They're in and out. This is not a ghetto in terms of preparation for being sent to an extermination camp. This is a neighborhood with gates in which people must stay at night. In 1573, 2 years after the ghettoization of Florence, the Department of the Interior, I'm going to call it that, it's actually the Nuovi Conservatori del Dominio e Giurisdizione, but I think it's a Department of the Interior, starts issuing Jews travel permits, starts giving them permits to leave, and not to leave just for the day. They're still allowed to do that, but to leave for 4 days, for 10 days, for 15 days, for a month. They start to give these travel permits, and on the permit goes the name of the person and the date on which they're leaving and for how many days they are allowed to go. Okay. Why in 1573? Why does this start? This new tool for regulating, let's not say controlling, for regulating Jewish travel and Jewish movement. It's bureaucratic. It is not something that they have to petition to the Duke to get a special royal privilege of some sort. It is bureaucratic. You go to the office, you pay a tiny amount of money, I don't know, $10, relatively speaking. They write it down, they give you a slip, and off you go. Why? They're not getting protection from wearing the badge. They have to wear the badge out there. But the reason that they ask for and get this type of tool, they ask for it and they get it, is because while they're outside the ghetto, traveling around, doing whatever it is that they need to do, and I'll mention what those things are, they don't want to be arrested for not being in the ghetto. You see, they're supposed to live in the ghetto. So if they're found in Empoli or they're found in Prato, what are they doing there? They're not allowed to be there. So now they have this little pass showing that they are allowed to be outside of the ghetto in the first place. And we have trouble. There's a woman named Bruna who is arrested outside the ghetto for wearing her badge incorrectly. She is wearing a badge that men are supposed to wear, which is a yellow circle. But the year prior, the real rule had been that the women had to wear a yellow cuff on their outer garment. They were buttoned. They had sleeves that were interchangeable as accessories. And Jewish women were supposed to wear a yellow one. She wasn't. She was wearing the circle, the men's badge. And she was arrested for the badge, right? But they had to clarify in the documents that she was not being arrested for being out there. She was being arrested for the badge because she did have her permit with her to be out there. Okay. Why did they go? You can imagine reasons why they went. Only 2 years earlier, they had lived in other cities. One woman, one of the first women to get a pass, needed to go back to her town to wrap up some business. She was dealing in wool. Another woman, only in 1573, she had to go back to her town of Empoli to try to settle her dowry, to collect her debts in that town that legal works that had been suspended while she had to move into the ghetto. Let me show you some images from this. Here's the decree from 1570 that put the Jews into the ghetto in the first place. Okay, a decreto generale edicto sopra gli ebrei che di presente abitano del dominio fiorentino. They are living in the dominion, the Florentine dominion, and they are going to be forced in the next few pages. This is the front of the document, forced to move into ghetto. Now, having explained what it means to live in the ghetto and having learned that they're allowed to go out during the day and they're allowed to go out for four days or 10 days or 15 days at a time in Florence, I need to show you some pictures of ghettos, but I don't have any of Florence, which was destroyed in the 19th century. So let's look at the Venetian ghetto, which was prior to the Florentine ghetto, and from which people also could get permits to leave. But according to a scholar named Benjamin Ravid, who studies the Jews of Venice, permits are found only for exiting at night. Let me show you. Here is, in the city of Venice, the ghetto. And get a little highlight. Here's your ghetto. And you can see with my highlight, I hope, is that highlighter visible a little light? Yeah. You can see that it doesn't have a wall around it. It's a ring of buildings, all right? It's a ring of buildings. Now it has a great big center piazza, which it wouldn't have had at the time. These are buildings that were closed up with some extra buildings and some gates. And the same was true in Rome and the same was true in Florence. The gates had to have gate houses. And this is going to be a little trickier to see. This is one of the canals here. And over it, you have one of the classic bridges we can only see going up the steps, not coming down the steps on the other side. But do you see these two small structures on either side of the steps? I need a few nods. Good, Carol, thank you. So these little houses have been preserved. And they were guard houses for the ghetto. They're actually the houses in which the guards sat. And they sat there at night. They didn't have to be there during the day. And what they did from those houses was they gave permits for people to leave at night for a fee. Oops, sorry. They gave permits for people to leave. Who had permission to leave? Doctor could say that he had a patient to visit, right? But there might be a concert in town that somebody wanted to go to. There was theater in Venice that people wanted to go to. And for a fee and writing your name in the ledger, out you went and back you came. Again, more mobility for the elite who could pay for it, but nonetheless restrictions and mobility. The other gate in Venice that is from the 16th century is this one. It looks just like a doorway between two stores. And in this doorway, you realize that there are storefronts to either side of it. Well, with storefronts to either side, that means that inside here, there's a room. And it's this store now, right? But it was a room and it had a window. And the guard sat inside there and did the same thing, controlled the ghetto. And here you can't really see it so well, but if you go there sometime, you'll see that the type of brick here is different from the larger bricks on the side. It's a later set of bricks filling in that space in order to make real stores on either side. So two types of permits: permission to stay out of the ghetto at night, seen in Venice, and permission to travel out of the city for more than 3 days at a time, seen in Florence. I think that we can stop in a second to take some questions just about that before we move in to the deeper material. Are there any questions yet coming into the chat?
Thank you, Professor Siegmund. This is really fascinating. I mean, I've been to Venice, so I'm finding it really interesting to see these images. So one question that came in kind of was how this was around the same time of Shakespeare, and a question about the Merchant of Venice and whether that story can jives with the Venetian ghetto.
I'm sorry, I just pressed something on the headphones. I'm not allowed to press. My son said, "Don't press that."
Okay, and then something came up. Oh, okay.
Okay. So, that question would take us pretty far away from this lecture. So I'll just answer it really briefly, if you don't mind. How can I make it relate to what we're doing? Give me a second. Certainly, there were still Jewish bankers in Venice at the time of Shakespeare, and that's a fact. And there was animus that you could see, that you see among some of the characters in The Merchant of Venice towards Jews, right? But I don't think that anybody thinks that Shakespeare seriously thinks that Shakespeare is representing actual Jewish life in Venice, but rather reflecting all kinds of complicated aspects of a developing English identity. And I refer you to, I will actually try to refer you to the scholarship about that in a chat later in the talk at the end, by James Shapiro. Anything else about the general time period? Yes. And about the institution of ghettos and the mobility, which I'm about to go much more deeply into. Anything important?
Oh, a question about, I mean, I think you may have addressed this earlier, but about, but we did, maybe if you can review, because we did have a question about what was going on in 1571 that caused the Jews to be ghettoized. I don't know if you can review that.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to say about why the Jews were ghettoized is this. This is what there's so many things that one could say about that. But what I'm going to say is I'm going to try to put it into this context of spatiality. It's a made up word, not a great word. My thinking about the ghettoization is that in the early modern period, with the exposure of Christian Europeans to the New World, right? Starting in the 1440s with Portuguese exploration and then enslavement of Africans on the west coast of Africa, and then into the explorations and conquests and effort to missionize in the Americas in the 1500s. There is a certain intellectual and social turmoil in Europe. It is very destabilizing to find out about all of these people who are not Christian, nor Jew, nor Turk. Other people, other ways of life, completely foreign. For example, they discover that the Native Americans don't wear beards, but they don't wear beards. So fashion changes in Europe and men have to wear beards. They have to distinguish themselves. It's just an interesting little example that the discovery of the Americas changes the Europeans. Now, they begin to think in terms of territory. And how do you define what is France? What is Tuscany? What is England? Where is it? And what we see in the 16th and especially in the 17th century are maps everywhere. Maps and maps and maps. And they start to draw lines and put boundaries in. This is not an argument that you've heard about ghettoization and anti-Semitism. I'm sorry. Right? I go in a different direction in my study. I can't say ghettoization is just the next step in anti-Semitism. I have to tell you why and happen and when. Okay. So the Jews are already subordinate to Christians, and the Jews already have a negative reputation, and Christianity already preaches that Jews are not saved, right? But the impetus for the actual ghettoization comes from the desire to put Jews in a place, put them in a specific place. Gypsies have to live in the gypsy camp. Nuns, convent, can't be having lots of doors and windows where they interact with with laity. And Jews have to live in one place and not be intermingling with Christians. And that place becomes the ghetto. And it's like a strictly ordered, mappable place. Okay, so complicated theory, not just about anti-Semitism, happens at this time when states are growing and asserting their control as Christian states. And I would love to be invited back for a big talk about ghettoization.
Thank you. I mean, some questions came in about whether there were other ethnic groups that, that also were ghettoized. I mean, you touched on that just now a little bit. I don't know if you want to talk about that more, if you want to continue.
I think we have 1 or 2 minutes for me to say something about that. In Italy at this time, it was a Catholic country, and the Jews were the only minority allowed to live there. So in Italy, in the Italian states rather, the Jews are the only legit minority allowed to live there, remember, by these contracts, these condotte. Their religion is protected. Muslims are the enemy, right? They belong in the Ottoman Empire and we're warring against them. There aren't any other groups. Protestantism becomes the next enemy. And Protestants are not allowed. There are no Protestants allowed in the Italian states in the 16th century. Their books are banned and burned. They are subject to the Inquisition. If people begin to meddle around with Protestant thinking, with Luther's translations of the Bible, no. So the only group that is ghettoized are the Jews, because they are the only group allowed to live there, except for gypsy camps, okay? And they're expected to move on after living there for a while. All right, shall we move on?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let me remind myself where I am. Okay. Now, something different. Now, I want to move you into the plague, and I want to move you into disease. And I want to question whether Jews are associated with disease at this time, and if so, why? Okay. In 1576, this is not the actual document. This is a century later when somebody put together a copy of these documents. In 1576, in Florence, there's a prohibition against non-resident Jews entering the Florentine state at a time of approaching plague. 1348, 1350 was the big Black Death, but the plague recurs, right? And people don't understand what it is yet. There's science, but they don't know what this is. They can't see the microbes. They can't see the bacteria under the microscope yet. They don't know what this is. They don't even know that fleas carry the plague, which is just incredible. They haven't figured that out yet. But they're associating the plague and the arrival of the plague with the arrival of goods being transported by people who transport secondhand goods, bales of wool and cloth and used clothing. They are associating Jews with those occupations because Jews are heavily involved in those occupations, deeply involved in those occupations. Jews are allowed to be in guilds. And in the guilds in Florence, the greatest number of Jews who live in the ghetto are members of the used clothing guild. Used clothing guild, it kind of sounds terrible, like, the thrift shop. But no, it's not. It's the recycling business. Okay, it's a big business in recycling. Expensive clothing is worn by the fashionable elite for a year or two at most before fashion changes. And all of that ermine and brocade and damask gets sold, and it gets taken apart and turned back into other types of clothing. And if there's just a scrap of material from something 50 years old, it gets turned into buttons and the silk for shoes. And so every single level of craftsmanship, from the button making to the mattress making to the making of finer clothing to be sent to the middle classes, is very, very Jewish at the time. But a prohibition against Jews, yes, it's a form of discrimination. It's a direct form of discrimination, because it could have been against anybody bringing any such goods into the state. Now, how Jewish was it? How Jewish was that discrimination? In 1579, sorry, I thought I had one for 1576 too, but it's gone. In 1576, the health department the Department of Health in Florence issues a notification that anyone coming to visit Tuscany, anybody, not Jews, must carry a travel pass and bring it to the gates of the city, any of the gates of the city. They have to get a pass which allows them to come. All right, to investigate what that means and why. Here is a gate. One of the gates, this one happens to be the gate in the direction of Prato, and all of its walls are gone. The Florentines saved their gates. Notice again that the walls are thick and there's staircases to go up them, so there's guards sitting in the gate. And just like the guards would be checking on the permits of the Jews coming and going, here the guards would be looking at the travel passes from anybody who wants to come in. What is this health department, the sanitation department? In 1527, the Florentines created a board of health, a health department. This is one of the first. They had that plague in 1350. It took them a long time, but they eventually developed enough infrastructure to have a Department of Health and Sanitation. and they had other tools to try to prevent the spread of this plague. What did they do? They had embassies. They set up ambassadors and spies, and they got daily reports by horseback on whether or not there was plague in all of the different cities in Italy with which they had relationships. They sent that message every day as a letter and a notification to the government. If there was plague coming or suspect, then they might decide nobody from that area is allowed to come at all. A kind of a quarantine, a ban, right? A border ban that we know something about to try to keep the plague out. And they did it quickly. What other technologies did they have? They, in addition to this sort of quarantine, they had, they set up charitable institutions. Well, that happened earlier after 1350. To try to separate out anybody that might actually have the plague. And in the autobiography of Gluckel of Hamelin, some of you might have read that, the autobiography of a 17th century Jewish woman from Germany. She talks about the great fear. One of her daughters, the neighbors thought that she had plague, and she went and hid her daughter in a Christian's house in a nearby village because it was so dangerous for the people to think that you had the plague. What else did they do? They set up quarantines for goods as well. And by the 17th century, they had international relations and treaties so that anytime there was suspicion of plague, the boats would come to harbor and have to stay there, depending on the degree of the threat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or red, yellow, green, depending on the extent of the threat and the type of goods on the ship would have to stay at harbor until they thought the threat was past. And only the captain would be allowed off. The crew and the passengers would have to stay until they saw whether or not people were getting sick. All of this is happening in the 16th century. Hey, go. All right. Here's another gate. And I want you to look carefully at the shape of the gates. This is the gate towards Rome, the Porta Romana. And here is the inside of the gate, huge, look how huge it is, of San Frediano, the gate towards where actually the Jews have their cemetery. Now, they don't know what's happening with the plague, and they don't know how it's being spread. They're burning mattresses because they have noticed that there's this relationship between straw and wool and the plague. They're distributing new mattresses to all the poor in the city. All right, they're doing all kinds of things, but the best thing that they can do are permits that establish whether or not somebody is sick. And so by 1579, just a few years later, and this is 8 years after the Jews have moved into the ghetto, and only 6 years after Jews begin to get permits that allow them to come and go for years, 10 years, or 15 years, or 30 days, 4 days, obviously 10, 15, or 30 days. In 1579, there's an edict coming from the government that Florentines may not lodge any foreigner who's not carrying a valid certificate of health, and so do other cities. So somebody is now producing a certificate of health, which means people before they leave are getting a vaccine card, right? They're getting their COVID test, they're getting their proof of health, and they're carrying it with them from city to city. Then something happens that really is going to change the situation. Sorry. A new requirement that in that same year that these health certificates, fede di sanità, have to say on them the age of the person and give their effigy. What's an effigy? It's a physical description of the person. Why? Now this little slip of paper that's also going to be in the ledger at the gate has to show the age of the person. He's 26, she's 32, and what that person looks like. And there are no documents found. I mean, no historian I've ever read in English, Italian, or Hebrew has yet found one of these slips of paper. Nobody has seen them. But the purpose is for Florence. One or two have been found for Prato. The purpose is to avoid transfer or fraud. I think I read this morning that Canada, what was it? Canada fined somebody $20,000. What was it? 2,000, please correct me, but a huge amount of money for forging a vaccine card, all right, in order to cross the border. They forged a vaccine card. So this is a requirement that the age and the effigy be on there in order to try to avoid transfer or fraud. That's a new tool of social control. That's carrying around a teeny little, what? A teeny little ID card. Let's see. I don't think we need to break for questions. Is there anything urgent? Because I put a break in there, but I think we can continue.
Yeah, we haven't gotten too many new questions.
Good. Okay, let me go on then. All right. The next year, this is the change that relates to the Jews. Just the very next year, something very interesting happens. I've been talking about the Department of Health, right? Health and Sanitation, actually. It's the Department of the Interior that's been issuing travel permits to Jews. In 1580, I see that there are no more permits for 30, 15, or 10 days. You can only have a 4-day permit. That means 2 days there and 2 days back. You know where you can't get to in 2 days? You can't get to Genoa. You know why that matters? Because Genoa is the hot seat of the plague always. It's always coming in at the port of Genoa. Now, these permits are issued by the Department of the Interior, not Health. And therefore, nobody is certifying that these Jews are healthy. Nobody is saying, I've passed the health test. But the same permit that previously just said that Rica of Pontedera is allowed to go there for 4 days, now would say Rica of Pontedera, who is tall and of medium stature, is allowed to go to Pontedera. And so all of a sudden, we have descriptions of Jews that they have to carry around. And nobody else has to carry these around when they travel. The only other things that other people would have to carry is a certificate of health if they, at the time of the plague, and only during the plague. So you have here a structural development, a new tool that, regardless of its original intent, can be used for controlling the movement, not just of people who are suspect of plague, but of anybody. Because these things didn't exist before in Europe. So I want to show you the Florentine ghetto and imagine the people leaving there and what that looks like. So this is a map from just a few years, from 1588, of the Florentine ghetto. This is the baptistery. Let me get some color. This is the oops, sorry. Get my pen and get my highlighter. It's working. All right, this is the baptistery, and this here is the ghetto. And notice also that it is not a circle with walls, and it doesn't have, there it is, in the middle, there is a well. Right there in the middle, there's a well, and this is pretty much what it looked like. It's been expanded somewhat since then, and it has gates. And here is one of the gates. And I'd love to get some color on this, and I don't have that color. Hello. Just can't seem to do it. But you can see me going straight in here. This is the public square with the fish market and the marketplace, which no longer exists, but Vasari's fish market moved to another part of the city. It was preserved. And here's the gate right there, a big tall gate, which was inserted to help close up the buildings, and another gate there. These gates should look very much to you like the gates that we've seen of the city, It's not so different, just smaller. This one is Porta al Prato, but again, connected to the walls, space in it for the guards to sit. A ghetto has gates like a city has gates. A ghetto can be closed and opened like a city can be closed and opened. And here's the best close-up of the ghetto that I can show you. So imagine the Jews are coming out in and out of the city all day long. They're staying inside normally. If they want to come out, they don't pay the guard here. They have to go to an office building during the day, and they have to get their documentation and pay for it, and then show it as they come in and out of the big city gates, not of their own gates. So here's the beauty of it. Here's the beauty of it. Hey. Technical glitch. Good. I know you can't read this. I'm going to show you close-ups. Okay, I'm going to show you close-ups. This is a typical document, a ledger. This is a ledger in the Department of the Interior's books, okay, where they write down all the doings every single day, all kinds of things. The Jews are the things having to do with the Jews are a small portion of everything going on for this Department of the Interior. But on this page, in the margin, I see here some letters which read LIC with a superscripted A, and then the word A Hebrei. It's a licencia a Hebrei, a license for the Jews, who were called the Hebrews at the time. Now, how am I doing for time? Oh dear. So we're going to spend the rest of our time on these documents because I've only got a half an hour somehow. Okay. Make sure I get to the really good stuff for the next half an hour. These permits are listed with the names, as I mentioned, and the age and the description and for how long the Jews are allowed to go. Here's a close-up of one of them. I'm going to read it out loud in Hebrew, and on the next slide, I've got a transcription and a translation. So first, really quickly in the Italian, Moise up the top. Moise di Michele Ebreo, Dani 23, statura bassa, barba nera, et a Gabriele di Giuseppe Dani 25, statura giusta, barba castagna. Okay. And it goes on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. On this one, at the end, it says, tutti ebrei, all of these Jews, di andare per il dominio per 4 giorni, secondo il solito. These are all Jews, not obvious, have to say it, and they're permitted to go through the dominion for 4 days. We don't need the transcription. We'll go to the translation. Okay, get us out of the way. Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing my own arrow here. There we go. Hello. There we go. So here, I'm showing the amazing history that I was able to learn about specific Jews because of this legal instrument or this administrative document that a government chose to initiate in 1580. Because they made documentation, I learned something, and you're going to learn it. Moise, son of Michele Hebreo, 28 years old, short, with a black beard. He's on the list. Gabriello, son of Giuseppe, 25 years, with a chestnut-colored beard. Aaron, proper stature, the right height, black beard. And then the women, Gentiletta, she's of Sabito di Viterbo, she's 50, she's medium height, and she's fat. And Diamante, the wife of Arone, the one above, notice I put them both in red for you, 23 years old, tall and thin, she's skinny. Speranza, the widow of Giuseppe and the mother of Gabriello, who's listed above, who's 25 years old, she's 60. Maybe. It's a rounded off age, so I don't buy it. Tall and thin. Gemma, the wife of Gabriello, 16 years old. Look, she's already married to this 25-year-old, short and thin. Lustra, wife of Moise, who's up there at the top. He's 28 years old and she's 24, and she's thin and tall. All of them are Jews, and they're permitted to go into the dominion for 4 days according to the usual mandate. Okay, this is interesting, right? Not that. I think that this is one of the more wonderful things that I found in the archives. And when I mentioned at the beginning, the travel permits, the first ones from 1573 to 1580 don't have these physical descriptions. After the Department of Health begins to require health permits for people at time of plague, after that, this is always put on the Jewish permits for travel. So I think that you can see in this really quick transfer of process of what should I call it? It's it's just the way things are done, right? This transfer of process from the Department of Health to the Department of the Interior is something that we should understand immediately. Government agencies look for the tools that are being invented, whether by private enterprise, software companies or aerospace companies, or by other government agencies. They then, apparently, and today, are watching what's going on. And they take and they use things that are helpful to them, so that certain tools of social control might be invented for one purpose, but very quickly they will migrate and be used for another purpose. And that's where the interesting question will come in for us, right? Do you want to invent certain tools and support them and use them because they are very helpful to you, like the Office of the Sanità, the health department, had this great way of trying to control whether or not the plague came to them instead of just a total quarantine, which when they did do a total quarantine, more people died in the city than in places that didn't have a quarantine. It also destroyed their economy. They did the total quarantine, people died of starvation. And people who are dying of starvation are more subject to disease, to all kinds of disease. So quarantine wasn't good, but travel permits with a health ID on them, certification that you're not carrying the plague, that was pretty good. And quarantine of goods in the port or outside the city to see whether or not people who had contact with it were infected with it, that was good, even though they didn't know what fleas were. But when they added the physical characteristics, so that these things couldn't be transferred, that gets moved immediately onto the Jewish permits. And now Jews are walking around with a document that says they're allowed to travel, and this is exactly who they are, and everybody knows that they're a Jew because it says so. Ebreo. The end of every permit, it says Ebreo or Ebrea, a Jew or a Jewess. So, not particularly devastating to them. In fact, it allows them to travel safely around. Right? It sort of helps them out. It doesn't seem very dangerous to them. But I think that it should give us pause. And we'll have time to discuss this, I think, to think about the ups and downs, the pros and cons of any particular tool that we might use. In this case, I want to point out, because this document, I have 120 of these documents, and I was able to become familiar with almost all the Jews of the ghetto, at what age they married, what their names were, where they were going. It was really very helpful documentation for the book that I wrote on Florence. And also wonderful. I mean, the black beards and the chestnut colored beards, just like wonderful. But one of the things that I noticed about this is that in the context of the Esker of people talking about all the tragedies that befell the Jews, one after another, that the temple was destroyed and the Jews were persecuted. The rabbis were martyred, and then somehow or other came the Jews accused of the poisoning the wells of the Black Death, and there were pogroms against them, and then they were expelled from Spain, right? If you go, and then the Holocaust, and if you go from tragedy to tragedy to tragedy, and you don't look at each individual thing and see why it happened specifically, how it fits into the broader society, you're missing the understanding that might very well help you prevent it and things like it from happening again, if you don't study it closely. So in this case, these permits do not describe the Jews in a racially stereotyped way. I would like you to notice that you could balance out the fat and the thin, the tall and the short. These are normal people from the perspective of the ones giving them the permit. They're Jewish, but otherwise they are normal people. And so it's not inevitable that this tool becomes, for example, a part of the history of racism. Right? We have to be careful. It doesn't become a part of the history of racism, but it reinforces the category of Jewish because it's only given to Jews. All right, let me try to summarize or open up a couple of questions. And I'm hoping that you'll be thinking about COVID and where licenses for COVID go. There are unintended consequences of the creation of these passes, not necessarily negative, but they are transferred, as we saw originally, from the safe conduct into the permit, into this travel photo ID, interacting with developments that are happening not just with Jews, but with non-Jews. But the identification as Jews and the concept that should be put on your passport or on your ID document clearly helped the Nazis track down Jews, right? Once you're keeping ledgers of who's Jewish and who's not. And to get away from Jewish history, it's also linked to the status of statelessness. Right? I read from the United Nations Commission on Human Rights that there are currently 4 million or possibly up to 10 million people who don't have citizenship anywhere. So the process of documenting people and documenting their rights can also push people out. People who don't have a document don't have any rights. Yeah? In the end, I think that we can see that Jews might have been used because they were a vulnerable minority as a little bit of an experiment. Like, let's see if this tool works. Can we issue these sorts of passes? And it's not necessarily conscious, but we see it over and over again. Minorities are treated differently, and the way in which they're treated, which reestablishes or enforces a hierarchy which oppresses them, those tools, the entire population is vulnerable to those tools being used. All right. Basically, technologies of surveillance and control that look helpful, that transfer from one branch of the government to another, that can happen even in 30 years, which is remarkable because people think of the pre-modern world as a world where things happen very, very slowly. And I think that it did take a long time for them to figure out what the plague was. They were still guessing, right? They were guessing like we were guessing. Now, how is COVID spread? We just didn't know. So we did all kinds of things. We washed our hands obsessively and didn't even catch a cold. And we wore our masks and we tried not to catch COVID. And the doctors wore oil slicked gowns so that whatever was in the air that they didn't understand didn't get at them. And they burned mattresses and they labeled as dangerous anybody who traveled, especially people who traveled with goods that they were transporting because that was their occupation. I'm going to stop here, and if there are specific questions about this material, I'd love to answer them. And if you have thoughts that you want to share about the pros and cons of the international vaccine card, which Europeans are debating seriously, then that's also, I think, a place where we can try to see, are there lessons from history that tell us whether or not those sorts of ID cards are a good idea, and what's the next piece that would be invented? If 3 years later they added the physical description to the travel permits, or 6 years later they added it to the travel permits, what's going to be added to our vaccine card 6 months later, or a year later, or 2 years later? I don't myself have a strong personal opinion on this matter. I do imagine that our passports, that the little barcode on there will very soon end up having our health status on there, which is scary. But there you have it, some information and some theories about the relationship between disease and travel and the Jews.
Thank you, Professor Siegmund. Yeah, I had a couple of questions come in, and I also wanted to mention, if you wanted to also get some comments from our participants, after we go through some questions, I can also open up the chat if you wanted to do it that way. So
sure.
Okay.
I can save that chat too.
What?
I'm going to stop sharing my screen then. I should have done that. I forgot.
So I had a couple questions come in just about how the travel permits were enforced, and also about the extent to which non-Jews had any travel permits as well, whether non-Jews had travel permits.
So the enforcement was very erratic. If you were supposed to bring your permit back to the same gate, whether it was Porta Romana, Porta al Prato, Porta, I forget where else, which other gate I showed you. You had to bring it back to the same gate so that the guard who was sitting at the gate could check you off that you had logged back in. I think if you weren't logged back in, you had a problem. And there were citizen arrests at the time, and people were allowed to go catch you. People liked going and catching you. And then there's a fine that you are paid for being out of the ghetto without authority, right? So then you're in jail, and then your community or your family has to pay to get you out. It's all about paying. It's all about the money. As far as the non-Jews, there's one interesting development I didn't mention. Ordinary people only had to have that certificate that they are healthy, right, in a time of plague, issued by their own city and that's trans-city travel, right, from one city to the next. They have to present that. They don't have to log it in, log it back. They just have to present it to show that they've been declared healthy. And honestly, that's not going to help all that much, right? It's more helpful to the state to say you have to have that pass, and you're not going to get it because we've closed that city off. People from that city aren't allowed to come. So we know what city you're coming from when you bring us that pass, and we reject it. That's not okay. You can't come. The other place where I have seen these passes with the physical description without a reference to health, there's only one other set that I've come across, and that is for the transport of prisoners. Transport of prisoners. If you have to take a prisoner from Florence to the port of Livorno, where they are going to be a slave in the galleys, which is a great new port for the Medici dukes. They created a city, and they built ships, and they used convicts as their slaves to row the galleys. And if you're being transported, you have to have this document with your description, so that should you get loose and you don't have it, you're going to be captured again or possibly put to death. So that's it. That's the best that I can do for now. Other questions, Tani?
I have a question about the extent to which these cards were used as a way to control the Jews in terms of economy at all.
Their economy?
Yeah.
Well, I think that when you limit it to 4 days instead of 10, 12, or 30, 15, I think that that was done for health reasons. I think that that was done to try to prevent them from going too far away where they might get the plague. But it did affect them economically. Because if you're only allowed to stay out for 2 days, for 4 days, you can't really maintain a full-time connection to the town from which you came, to a business, to a family living elsewhere. So it made them much more constricted, and they became more and more local. These Jews became less and less interregional. Families didn't leave the ghetto very often after 1580, 1585. Before then, the first 15 years of the ghetto, the wealthier families looked for people to marry their children to in distant cities where there weren't any ghettos yet. They moved out if they could. But the less wealthy Jews found themselves cut off both from the businesses they had, where they had lived, and also unable to make those relationships farther away. You know, one of the reasons they were traveling was that there were fairs set up, markets, and every day of the week, there'd be a market someplace in Tuscany, and the Jews would want to go there. They would want to go to the markets to sell things and to make connections. So it became harder for them. And,
Thank you. I don't actually have too many questions right now. If you did you want to continue or?
Well, I see. We have 10 minutes left. Yeah, sure. So I thought it might be interesting to look at the documents more closely with you, but if that is not necessary, then I can go back to, just one second, let me go back to something that I didn't miss. I can go back to the question of mobility in general and ghettoization. In the ghetto of Venice, there's a very famous autobiography of a rabbi from Venice named Leone Modena. Anybody read that? It's available in paperback. I only see the first page of hands, but I've got 11. Come on, somebody raise a hand. This is a big group. You're a big group. The autobiography of Leone Modena, which is available in paperback, it's one of the first autobiographies. He describes his life in Venice. He has some crazy stories. One of his sons dies from alchemy, and one of his sons dies in a murder, right? And one of his sons is a gambler, and he's a gambler, but he's also a writer, an intellect, a teacher, and a kind of an amazing man who writes a very, very long autobiography in Hebrew. He wrote this in the early 17th century, and he lived in the ghetto of Venice, and there isn't one reference anywhere in the whole book, which I've read so many times because I teach it, not one reference to the ghetto. How is that possible? He doesn't use the word ghetto. He doesn't refer to coming in and out of the gates. He doesn't talk about it once. He talks instead almost as frequently as possible about all the places he went. He went to the wedding, he went to study, he went to give a lecture, he went to visit his sick relative, right? He goes places. So I think that movement and mobility at a time that the Christian governments are restricting you to the ghetto is very important for people's status and maybe mental health. And they're always going out as much as possible to get away from this constriction. So I've done some charts and graphs, and one of the ways that I've actually tried to identify the elite in Florence is by how much they travel. And there's a direct correlation between how much they travel in all the years that I have documents for, and whether or not they are also heads of the Jewish internal government, and whether or not they are in the higher level guilds. Movement is important to us. And the freedom to travel is very important to us. And it's just one of the ways that governments take control, is by controlling who moves where. There's a great deal of anxiety about people moving places, and it might start with moving plague. And then with the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church is anxious about the movement of ideas. With the Inquisition, censorship of books, they're anxious about the spread of books, heresy, right? And then they're anxious about now. We're anxious, I'm gonna say we're anxious about vast movements of people into our countries who don't, I'm thinking Europe really, and Italy, huge numbers of immigrants from other countries who aren't Italian, who might not care yet about the historic treasures of the cities of Italy, French people, so you get xenophobia, right? Fear of people moving into your place and taking your place and your privilege and your status. So I think all of this is very interesting. And I think that I don't have Jewish texts to share with you. How do the rabbis feel about X, Y, or Z? Because I don't think that they had a lot of circumstances to think about this. And the only way I see this as relevant to the rabbinic tradition is that these Jewish communities tried to control who came in, not who left. They tried to control who was allowed to move into their communities. They tried to get permission from the state authorities to be the ones who decided whether or not strangers and foreigners were allowed to live with them in their ghetto. So everybody's worried about their boundaries and feeling safe inside their boundaries and feeling in control of when they leave and when they come back. Goes both ways. Feeling very safe in your cocoon during COVID was important. And finishing that, we see like this huge explosion of young people getting out, right? Anyway, I think that my study of Jewish mobility has been, I'm influenced by the amount of travel that I see them doing. And now these connections I just find really amazing, this connection between the health permits that we are looking at today and the fact that they had health permits then. So just wanted to bring that to you. Tani, that's it.
So much, Professor Siegmund. I did get a couple more questions in. That's okay. One question was about how long these travel passes from that period lasted for. How long?
What?
How long the travel passes from that period lasted for? Did you do you know at what point they ended?
Good question. That's a really complicated question for an historian. I found 15 years of them. And I found that the health permits with the physical identification only lasted 1 year, a year that they were very concerned about plague. But in the decades that followed, I do not know yet whether a different agency in the government took over. I do not know. I haven't been able to find that yet. And doing archival work, it's not looking for a needle in a haystack. That's not what it is. You don't just randomly turn all the pages in the archives, but it is hard. It's more of a detective path. And I have not made it my major task to pursue, what happened to these permits, but I haven't seen what happens to them after 15 years. Yeah, question. I also would love to know what it looked like when they were getting the permits. I would love to know whether when you get a group permit, I would love to know whether each individual person had to come up and state his or her age and then got described, or whether somebody came to that office with a whole list already. I would love to know what happened. And the children are there too. The children are there. And there are, I had a child, I have a child who was very into some toy, I forget, some online digital tool. I totally forget what it was, some years ago. And I wanted him to do art. I still want somebody to do an art project. Maybe a Zoom screen with all the little boxes, that would work too, with people with different colored hair and beards, and put them all up there as the Jews of the ghetto. I can imagine, I'm seeing 10, 15, 20, 25 of you right now. And I'm imagining that you could put the name of each one of them and just a person with that color hair and that color beard, and fat or thin or regular size, the men and the women and the children. And we could take a snapshot of what the Jews of the ghetto of Florence look like. Artists? Hadassah? No, that's not. Anybody want to put a hand up and be my artist? It's a great project. Send me an email if you do.
I can put your email address in the chat if you
Please
like.
do. Anybody who wants a reference to a book about the Jews.
I did get a couple of questions about books as well, so you may get some.
I have to look in the chat. And
I just sent your email address in the chat, so they can email you directly about that.
Sure, do that, because I'm not seeing it.
Another question that came in just from a little bit earlier was about, do you know anything about the proportion of Jews that that passed away during the Black Plague, like proportionally? Or
yeah, so in 1348-50 in Europe, we don't have exact numbers. I don't even know how historians came up with this idea of 50% of people dying, but we know that it was enormous. That was a big demographic project, and there aren't enough Jews for us to know. There aren't enough Jews for us to do that kind of demographic study. But it would be correct to say that everywhere that there was plague, Jews died. So we can just say that it's not true that their good, hand washing or their diet protected them. Wealthier Jews were able to protect themselves in general whenever there was a plague. You know how Boccaccio's story begins, the Decameron, with all of the nobility go to the villa outside the city? Well, if you go to the villa outside the city, that means that you're not going to be infected by the rest of the people who are not healthy, right? Because the fleas aren't being carried with them and their used clothing or whatever else they walk in with. So protection in that way, the wealthy were protected better than the poor, who lived in closer quarters, and the fleas were able to hop from one object to another person. I don't have numbers. Okay, any other questions?
I had one kind of question, which I think we can do, will be our closing question. Has doing your research during COVID, you approach it, these kinds of issues that you raise, well, changed for you?
Right. So I'm in the middle of a different research project. And so the stories that I'm bringing you right now, and I could tell you all about the different people and where they traveled to that I've tried to track down. The research that I'm doing now, I would have been in the Florentine archives. So first of all, I've been home for how many months like you have? I'm not traveling anywhere. And that means that I'm doing, maybe I would say, closer reading of things that I already have collected rather than new information. It's really kind of interesting because if you look more closely at things you've already collected, you see things in them that you might not see if you're still busy collecting. I have to just tell you, okay, so that's about the process. As far as the content goes, if it hadn't been for COVID, and I would not have thought immediately to jump into this lecture series, right? Because I'm thinking about plague and thinking about my permits and thinking about the relevance of scholarship. Why is it relevant to talk about and learn about the 16th century, I think that it's a big challenge to explain to people that are not naturally interested in history why we care, why we care. We care because we see things unfold, and people were smart in every century, right? People are not smarter now than they used to be. So every pattern that's going to happen now has happened already in one way or another, and you should look for it and then take the time to think, what are the consequences? What are the unintended consequences? How do I balance it? You know, are the consequences inevitable, or can we control where they go? So I hadn't thought about my permits that way before. And I went back and I found this connection between the health permits and the travel permits, and the way it spread specifically from one department in the government to another. So, you know, who is it that's going to give us these health certificates, and who's going to get access to that? Everybody's going to get access to that. Is that okay? What else is going to be on there? Should I personally like it or not? I don't know. I took my phone and I tried to download the Excelsior pass. I didn't really know why, but it's the New York State COVID vaccine pass. If you've heard of it, it's supposed to help us do things in the future. And I couldn't download it because I've got a 5. So far I haven't gotten myself involved in this universal vaccination, proof of vaccination. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Oh, I thought I was muted. Thank you so much for making that period, really come to life for us, and raising these really relevant and timely issues for us to
Thank you.
about.
Struggle with them, go ahead. And if there's a Jewish way of thinking about it, then if there's a Jewish way of thinking about it, then what is it? I'm not going to tell you what it is, because I think that we bring a lot of our own ethical modern values to bear, and we say they are Jewish because we are Jewish. All right. So to think, is there an authentically Jewish perspective on novelty and on the risks to human rights that can come with new technology? I don't know. I think it's a good question. Thank you all for coming. It's I wish that I were in the room with you better, and that I could actually hear you and see you, and more than 3 of you at a time while I'm talking. But I'm seeing so many names, and I hope to see your names again, and in person as well as online with so many of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Siegmund, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you'll join us next week with Dr. Rachel Rosenthal. Our session will be Work-Life Balance in Ancient Times, Why the Rabbis Left Their Homes to Study Torah. So we have a very different kind of session next week, and we hope you'll join us for that. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.